This is part 4 of the Ontario Apple IPM workshop series, Direct Insect Pests Early Season. My name is Christy Grigg-McGuffin. I'm a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. And throughout this series, we're going to be discussing various insect and disease common in Ontario apple orchards, including their identification, biology, how to monitor for them, as well as some general management practices.
So before we get into a discussion on the particular insect pests, I wanted to just touch base on what is meant by a direct versus an indirect pest. And now this really depends on what part of the plant is attacked. In apples in particular, a direct insect pest feeds specifically on the fruit, whereas an indirect pest is an insect that attacks the leaves, the trunk, or any other part of the tree. Now, major pests have the potential to cause some major economic loss, and in most cases, direct pests are also considered major pests. And while indirect pests may limit fruit yield, they're often considered minor pests. That does not mean that indirect pests cannot cause significant economic loss in an orchard. In the following presentation, I'm going to be touching base on the direct insect pests that are found early season in an apple orchard. So this would be pests that are active from early bud break up until bloom. And these would include things like spring feeding caterpillars, mullen bug, tarnish plant bug, plum curculio, and oriental fruit moth. And while European apple sawfly is active pre-bloom, I will discuss this in part 5 of the workshop series. Spring feeding caterpillars are going to be oftentimes the insects that are found first in an orchard. These can be active very, very early in the season from bud break on. And the spring feeding caterpillars really consist of a complex of multiple species. I have a few examples here of some of the common insect pests that are found in Ontario apple orchards. And these include oblique-banded leaf roller, eye-spotted bud moth, green fruit worm, gypsy moth, and green pug moth. But it's not limited to these species. There are a number of others that are around. And damage in the orchard really varies depending on what species it is that you're dealing with, as well as the time of year in which you have that issue. In most cases, what classifies them as the direct insect pest is the damage directly to the fruit itself. You can see a common characteristic of spring feeding caterpillar damage is this cap-facing appearance that can occur. And this is the feeding on that fruitlet at the very, very early stage of development. And so then it causes this deformity of the fruit as it continues to grow. So you get these deep cavities, very misshapen fruit, and some large areas of scabby or russeted tissue. And the fruitlet can also have some superficial feeding seen in the bottom corner here. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see a fine outline of lighter colored skin here. And that's an indication that there was a leaf that was resting against this fruit as it was developing. And what ended up happening was that this was actually a foliar feeding insect, and it just happened to also feed on the surface of the fruit as it was feeding on the leaf itself. Another impact that can happen and cause significant economic injury are insect pests like green pug moth, which will actually eat the blossom itself, as you can see in the bottom left picture here. And so this will feed directly on the bloom, reducing any sort of pollination and impeding any fruit set that may happen. Otherwise, other sort of injury that's common of the spring feeding caterpillar complex with the leaf rollers, or they are extensive foliar feeders, so you get these large chomps out of the leaves. They can roll the leaves up. You often see pupa cases similar to what you're seeing in this picture here. And so that can impede photosynthetic capabilities of the plant depending on the pressure, the pest pressure within the orchard. And also within that group of spring feeding caterpillars also involves the tent caterpillar. Now, a lot of times you won't start really seeing pressure from this pest until later in the season when they start developing these dense webs on the branches. It often looks worse than it actually is. This can really be managed well through pruning out these large colonies. This is kind of a typical appearance of presence of spring feeding caterpillar in the orchard. You can see those large feeding holes on the leaves, and the leaf will continue to grow. Even if this damage happened early season, the leaf can still continue to grow and thrive, but you will see those holes present for the remainder of the season. And here's just another example of how that superficial feeding can occur. The leaf was likely against the fruit, and it just happened to have some additional feeding. And so the fruit, as it develops, then it scabs over and produces this russeted appearance. As I mentioned, then these spring feeding caterpillars are active very early season, so you can start to see their activity about half-inch green, and this will carry on till about mid-June, but depending on the species, they can continue on until harvest as well, and I'll talk about oblique-banded leaf roller in particular. In terms of monitoring, it really depends on the time of the year. Prior to petal fall, before fruit has started to set, then it's ideal to look at 5 terminals and 5 fruit buds per tree, ideally 10 trees within a block. And I usually consider a block to be about a 4-acre area, 4-hectare area. After petal fall, though, monitoring can focus specifically on terminals, looking at 10 terminals per tree on those 10 trees throughout the orchard. Now, in terms of thresholds for spring feeding caterpillars, it depends on the species. So because oblique-banded leaf roller is the most economically significant pest of that group, then it has a much lower threshold or a lower tolerance for this pest because it can cause quite significant economic injury. And so the threshold for oblique-banded leaf roller is 1 to 2% of those infested terminals that were observed while you're monitoring. If 1 to 2% of those infested terminals do have oblique-banded leaf roller present, then control is warranted for that pest. With the other spring-feeding caterpillars, of those terminals that were monitored, if 10 to 15% are infested with the caterpillars, then control is warranted. So depending on the species, it is possible to physically remove it from the orchard, pruning out infested branches or obvious egg masses. In particular, something like tent caterpillar, where the webbing is very distinct, pruning out that branch and removing it from the orchard, burning it to get rid of those caterpillars can help to reduce those populations. However, with other insect pests, this isn't necessarily an effective type of control. Now, there are a number of natural enemies that are around the orchard that do feed on these soft-bodied caterpillars. These can include birds, beetles, stink bugs, assassin bugs, spiders, parasitic wasps. If it's a warm, wet spring, you may often see some fungal or viral diseases on these caterpillars as well. However, in high pressure situations, biological control is not something that's going to provide economic control if it's used alone. That said, it's really important to consider this biological control and the presence of these beneficial insects if threshold is exceeded and chemical control is warranted. So selecting products that have a reduced impact on the beneficial populations, or considering timing for this to really help limit exposure and encourage the growth of those beneficial populations. Another insect that you'll see early season, it's very common in the orchard, is the mullen bug. And now there are 2 life stages that will typically be seen, and both will cause damage. So the nymph, seen on the left here, is kind of a lime to yellow color, and it has red eyes on either side of its head. You may or may not see, depending on how you're looking for this pest, you may or may not see the clubbed antenna. It's usually seen only under high magnification. The adult is an oval insect with wings, so it does fly away rather quickly if it's disturbed on the tree. It's green, similar to the nymph in terms of color, green to a tan depending on the age, and it has black spotted spiny hind legs that can be seen really well under a hand lens. Now, it's really easy to see a difference between pests when you look at high resolution pictures. It's a completely different situation when you're out in the field, because really a green insect pest looks like a green insect pest. It's important though to really be able to understand the distinguishing characteristics of an insect pest and be able to differentiate it from others that may appear similar, just so that you know in terms of proper management programs. So the top you can see again here is an example of a mullen bug nymph with that lime green color and red eyes. Now, unfortunately, there are other insect pests that look very similar to mullen bug nymphs, and I have some examples listed here on this slide. So with green apple aphid, one of the really distinct characteristics you want to look for are the presence of these cornicles or these tailpipes off the back end of the insect. And we'll talk about green apple aphid in a later presentation. Leaf hoppers, these tend to be rather wedge-shaped or carrot-shaped and quite lime green in color, typically with white eyes. And with leaf hoppers, their movement is very sporadic. So that tends to be the distinguishing characteristic for those. They, depending on the species, their movement is either forward or back or side to side like a crab, and it can really help identify what pest it is that you're dealing with. The third pest that's commonly mistaken with mullen bug nymphs are the tarnished plant bug nymph. And as you can see here, it's lime green in color, similar to mullen bug, but it does have the presence of 5 black spots on the back. And those can really appear well with the hand lens. Damage caused by mullen bug creates these raised pimple appearances. It's the piercing, sucking mouth parts, and so as it feeds on that developing fruitlet, it causes these raised bumps. The fruit continues to grow, and so you can get this kind of stretching appearance over the skin as it grows around these feeding parts. So there are susceptible cultivars, in particular to mullen bug, and these include things like Red Delicious, Spartan, Spy, Empire, Cortland, Ambrosia, Gala, Jonah Gold, and Golden Delicious. So if any of these cultivars are present within the block, then focusing your monitoring program for mullen bug in these areas will really help give an idea of what the population levels are like. So mullen bug overwinters as eggs in the bark, and the nymphs emerge in that early season. It can be earlier than bloom in that pink stage typically, and they can be a problem up until petal fall. Now their activity continues throughout the year, and I'll talk about that in the coming slides. But monitoring for this pest throughout that bloom to petal fall time is really important because hatch is typically synchronous, and so it's possible that threshold can be missed because it can happen so quickly. And the way that mullen bug are monitored is through tapping. And with this, you would tap 25 trees per block. And on each tree, it's 1 limb. Doing only 1 tap on the tree, as soon as you start to shake the tree, it can disturb the other pests on the tree. So it's best to move to another tree to do another tap. And when I refer to taps, it's holding the tapping tray below the tree, similar to what you're seeing in this picture, and then using a stick to tap 2 to 3 times on a large limb, then observing what insects have dropped down onto the tapping tray. So threshold for mullen bug, 7 to 10 nymphs per 25 taps that occurs in the orchard. So the threshold is relatively low, depending on the pressure of the pest in the orchard. Now, I mentioned that the timing of concern for this pest is up until petal fall, but that their activity does continue throughout the season. And the interesting thing about mullen bug, the important thing to know about this pest, is that during the summer, shortly after petal fall, mullen bugs are actually important predators in the orchard for mites, aphids, scale, and midges. And so after this point, once they start to feed on these other pest populations, it's important to include mullen bug as part of the beneficial counts throughout the season. One way that you can determine when they've transitioned over to feeding on these other insect pests is the presence of a red belly. So looking closely at these nymphs, you can see, and there's an example in this picture here, you can see their abdomen start to turn a red color as they start to feed on insect pests such as European red mite. Now, with mullen bug, it's important to understand that the damage and the pressure can really depend on food availability. So in situations where there is a high amount of alternate food sources, whether it's plant or animal food sources, it is possible that mullen bug populations can exceed threshold but not cause economic damage. On the other hand, if alternate food sources are scarce, it's entirely possible that a low population below threshold can still cause significant damage. It's also important with mullen bug because of their activity occurring over that bloom period. If there is an extended bloom, then if control products were applied during that pink stage, it's possible that the residues will not be significant enough to maintain control at petal fall timing. So continuing to monitor those populations and determining whether an additional petal fall control is warranted is very important. However, once that fruit reaches kind of a dime to quarter size, then any sort of damage or pressure from this pest is no longer warranted. So tarnished plant bug is a sporadic pest of orchards that you'd see in that early season as well. And there's two life stages that can be found. I've already touched on the nymph of tarnished plant bug. It's green color with those 5 black spots. The adult is a brown and yellow colored insect with a very distinct, if you can look under a hand lens, then what will stand out is this yellow Y shape that's on its back. Now, tarnished plant bug does tend to fly away very quickly if disturbed, so it's not surprising if you miss the presence of the adults. And so these pests feed on the developing fruit buds. So you typically won't see the insect itself, but you may notice, especially on early mornings when there's still dew on the tree, you may see presence of an amber ooze that's coming from damaged buds where the tarnished plant bug has been feeding. And then as that fruit continues to develop, if it doesn't abort early, if the fruit continues to develop, then what you're left with are these dimpled or sunken areas on the fruit from where they were feeding on that developing fruit bud. And here's just some other examples of that damage. And you can see that as the fruit continues to grow and mature around that damage, then you can get this deformity of the fruit that can happen. Now, tarnished plant bug are part of a plant bug complex, and so it doesn't mean that that's the only sort of damage you'll see. It just tends to be the most common of the plant bug pests in an orchard. However, you may see some damage caused by other plant bugs, including the apple red bug, which tends to cause, you can see that that dimpled feeding damage, but it's oftentimes surrounded by a flat russeted area. Green apple bug, also known as pear plant bug, can cause these raised russeted bumps where their feeding damage has occurred, and they can be quite distinct. So tarnished plant bugs overwinter as adults in leaf debris on the orchard floor, and they're active in that early season. Typically by May or early June, they've moved out of the orchard to alternate hosts like weeds or other vegetables. In that early spring, you're looking for presence of that ooze on flower buds. You can also keep an eye out when you're doing your tapping for mullen bug. Keep your eye out for any indication of nymphs or adults that may fly away quickly. With tarnished plant bug, there are no thresholds that exist for this pest. So populations of tarnished plant bug are highly correlated to weed management within the orchard. They prefer habitats like chickweed, dandelion, clover, pigweed, and lamb's quarters. So presence of these weeds in the orchard will facilitate populations of tarnished plant bug. It's also important to avoid mowing from bloom to petal fall, as the adults that are down in the weeds on the orchard floor will then be disturbed and fly up into the tree. When it comes to planning planting sites, do consider what's in the area, what's adjacent to that new orchard. And if you are surrounded by susceptible crops like alfalfa or strawberry, chances are you will have high populations of tarnished plant bug in that early season. Now, in general, chemical control is not usually warranted for tarnished plant bug. It's not a targeted pest in particular, unless it's a perennial problem and damage can occur year after year. But typically, insecticides that are applied for other pests in that early season will have some suppression on this pest as well. Plum curculio is another pest that you may see in that early season. Activity can start as early as pre-bloom. In terms of the life stages, the larval stage you likely won't see in the orchard. These are developing within the fruit, and these are white, legless grubs, rather indistinct in terms of appearance. What the life stage that you will likely see if you do come across it in the orchard is the adult stage. And so plum curculios are of the weevil family. So they're a snout beetle. In other words, you can see this long, almost like an elephant trunk that extends, and this is what they use to pierce into the fruit. With plum curculio, the adults have 4 distinct bumps on the back of their wing covers, but this can only be seen under high magnification. So damage from plum curculio can happen in 2 ways. The most commonly found type of damage in the orchard are these crescent-shaped oviposition scars. And this occurs when the female takes that long snout of hers and cuts a crescent shape in the fruit, peels back that skin, and lays her egg within the flesh of the fruit. You can see here in this picture, there's the female with her long snout. She's cut that crescent shape, and here is the egg that's been removed from under there, just so that you can get an idea of what it's like. So this egg is then underneath that skin, where it then grows and develops protected underneath the skin. Now, depending on where this oviposition happens on the fruit, then the damage that can appear can be quite different from that kind of typical crescent shape. You can see here that there was some egg laying that occurred in that early development stage right by the calyx of the fruit. And so as that fruit grows and matures, then this can get these scarring appearances can get rather misshapen. So they don't always fit that characteristic crescent or D shape that you see. The other type of damage that can occur from plum curculio is the summer feeding from the adults. And so they're using their snouts to pierce circles within the fruit itself, feeding on the flesh. And it's not uncommon with this feeding to also see presence of secondary pathogens as well. So some fruit rots entering within that wound and spreading in that fruit. And here's just some other pictures of that plum curculio feeding damage that can occur. You can see those small circles from where the adult has inserted their snout into the fruit to feed. Plum curculio overwinter as adults, either in the leaf litter on the orchard floor or more commonly adjacent to the orchard, typically in woodlots or hedgerows beside the orchard. And so adult activity begins about pink and continues until petal fall. And this activity is usually triggered by warm, humid weather, often when the fruit is just starting to develop. So monitoring, because they often migrate into the orchard, then monitoring along those perimeters or in wild fruit trees adjacent to the orchard give an early indication of plum curculio activity. And in terms of thresholds, it's really looking for signs of fresh injury. So anything that may still have signs of sap oozing from the oviposition scars, nothing that has started to scab over or really heal itself. So indications of fresh injury warrant a control program. Unfortunately, with plum curculio, there's very little alternate strategies to chemical control for managing this pest. Pruning, of course, to open canopy will help to improve spray coverage. There has been some work that's been done looking at bait trees that can help to lure plum curculio to a particular area. Also, the use of kaolin clay or surround can help to deter any sort of oviposition or feeding damage that may occur, because it makes basically the surface of the fruit and the leaves unappealing for the Plum Curculio to move around on. When it comes to chemical control, though, so long as the pest is not resident in the orchard, so it's known that it's migrating in and the damage is occurring along the perimeter, then doing border sprays with particular products can be effective. There are also degree days that have been developed for Plum Curculio, and that can be used to help kind of monitor the activity depending on what's going on in the orchard. So I'll talk a little bit more about degree days in the coming slides. But first, the last insect pest that I wanted to touch on during this presentation is Oriental fruit moth. Now, there's two life stages that you may see. The larva is an internal feeder, so it would be within the fruit, and oftentimes you can also see it in the shoots, which I'll talk about just momentarily. But the larva is typically cream to pink body with a brown head capsule. It can look fairly similar to some of the other insect pests, and this will be discussed in later presentations. The adult is quite a small moth, and it's rather indistinct in terms of its pattern. It's a gray mottled color, gray to brown mottled color, and can be rather indistinct on a trap. So in that early season, before the fruitlets begin to develop, Oriental fruit moth can cause flagging on the shoot, where the larva actually tunnels into that new growth on the succulent shoot and feeds on the inside of the limb. And so this causes dieback of the leaves. The stem can fold over and create this flagging appearance. So looking for signs of entry hole, you can see in this picture here where the larva has entered into that shoot. It's often also surrounded by presence of brown crumbled frass too. So looking for, it's a type of insect excrement, it's what frass is. And so presence of that in that area will help determine whether you're looking at Oriental fruit moth or something like fire blight. Once that fruit starts to develop, though, then the larva is going to be an internal feeder of those developing fruitlets. And this pest enters into the fruit, tunnels into the fruit, and feeds around the flesh of the fruit. So it does not feed on the seed cavity. And this is important in terms of being able to differentiate it from other pests, which will be discussed at a later date. So Oriental fruit moth overwinters as a late instar larva, typically under the bark of the tree or within the leaf litter on the orchard floor. And the adults start to emerge in that pre-bloom timing, but activity usually peaks around petal fall. And this activity continues through multiple generations throughout the year, right up until harvest. Monitoring is usually done using pheromone traps. The picture here is an example of a diamond trap, but you can also use a delta trap with a removable liner, depending on your preference. And the use of these pheromone traps can either be to establish a biofix if you're using degree day modeling, which I'll talk about just momentarily. Can be used to time flight activity if you're not using a degree day model. And it can also be used as a sentinel trap for mating disruption, which I'll also talk about in the coming slides. So the picture here is an example of a delta trap with a removable liner, another option for monitoring for Oriental fruit moth. And traps in general should be installed in that late April so that you're able to get those out prior to adult flight starting in that pre-bloom stage. Ideally, one trap per 4 hectares, and having multiple traps throughout the orchard will really help give a good representation of what the population levels are like. Now, with trapping, what's really important is understanding that though you are using a lure that's supposed to be attractive to a particular pest, does not mean that all of the catches on the trap are going to be that particular pest. So understanding the distinguishing characteristics, being able to identify the particular insect that you're looking for is going to be really important, especially if setting biofix or using it to determine a control program. So in this picture here, you can see Oriental fruit moth caught on the trap in the top right corner here of the trap. But a very common bycatch that you get in Oriental fruit moth traps is the lesser appleworm. And you can see in terms of size, it's very similar. The only difference is with lesser appleworm, it has this white banding to look for. So thresholds can be used to determine when control products should be applied. If trapping, then determining that after the upswing in trap catches can work, but there have also been degree days that have been established for Oriental fruit moth, and it's for all generations throughout the season. So I've touched a number of times on degree day models, and I thought I would just spend a moment to define what exactly this is. So most pests have a temperature range in which they develop. Anything below that, or they're known as the base temperature, or anything above that range, and growth does not happen. So if you accumulate the number of hours during the day, which were within that ideal development range, then you can use this to help target or predict key life events of that particular pest, whether that's egg hatch or emergence for particular activities, or it can be for disease infection as well. The common calculation that's used to determine this degree day, these degree day models is shown here on this slide. And so this looks at the average temperature for the day. So in other words, the maximum temperature plus the minimum temperature divided by 2. And this is minus the base temperature, or that temperature below which development doesn't occur. And these are defined temperatures that have been set for particular pests, and they can be found throughout literature. So these degree days are then accumulated over time, again, to be used to predict particular life events. The other thing that I've mentioned a number of times is the use of pheromones. And so these, in most cases, this is often a sex pheromone produced by the female to attract a male, but there are some pheromone lures that have been developed that you make use of other types of pheromones like aggregation pheromones. But I have down in the bottom corner here just a kind of an example of what happens in nature. So here's that female, and she is releasing a large pheromone plume, which the male then detects on his antenna and is able to hone in and detect that female on the branch for mating to occur. So use of pheromone lures basically mimics this natural occurrence. And so it can lure the male into a trap and be used to monitor populations. Now, if these pheromones are released in higher concentrations, this can be used for mating disruption. You can see in that top picture here an example of a mating disruption tie that's commonly found within orchards, and this can be really effective for Oriental fruit moth management. The way that mating disruption works is one of 2 ways. So either the dispensers can outcompete with the female. So the male is attracted to the plume that's released from the dispenser as opposed to the female. Or the release of pheromones in such high concentrations can desensitize the male to the chemical. In either case, mating doesn't occur, and so you have a reduction in populations. And as I said, this can be very effective for Oriental fruit moth. There are lures that are available for other pests as well, with varied efficacy depending on the characteristics of the insect pest. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. If you're looking for more information, I do suggest you take a look at the apple module on our Ontario Crop IPM website. That information can also be found in our publication 310, Integrated Pest Management for Apples. So with that, I thank you for joining me. My contact information is here on this slide if you need to reach out to me with any comments or questions. I do also encourage you to subscribe to our fruit blog at onfruit.ca for timely information of Ontario fruit production.